had you on Science Changing Life 2 years ago to talk about pandemic preparedness.
Yep.
So, in those 2 years, how have you seen the landscape change?
Interesting. I think, we're probably more sick of the pandemic than we were 2 years ago, right? So I think people are trying to put it in their rearview mirrors. Unfortunately, I don't think we have implemented any of the lessons learned from that. So, I think there's still time, right? There's still things that I think can be done. But interesting since 2 years ago, right? We've had two viruses now knocking on our door. So we have mpox, which is becoming concerning, and now you're starting to see it in children, which means that it's not passed through direct sexual contact, but it's going to be a little bit more transmissible. That could launch. Bird flu H5N1 it's been with us since '95, but it has really spread through our farm community, our dairy community, and our poultry community at rates that are extraordinarily alarming. And what also has been alarming is the lack of response to these events happening, right? Especially at the government level. We haven't seen the kind of coordinated response that I think should be put into place after what happened in 2019, 2020, right? And so we're hoping that we've gone from a place pre-COVID where people thought pandemics were just the hypothetical, right? That, okay, it happened 100 years ago.
It's
who
not
knows?
going to happen
It couldn't
now.
happen now
Yeah.
for one reason or another, right? We're too sophisticated. We have all these things in place, but, clearly we're not a pandemic-proof society. So, the hope is that, people, given, we were just talking about all the other things going on in the world, once some of that calms down, we're able to refocus on being prepared. Because, again, an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure, right? And
Right.
so, if we can do a few things now, that can save millions of lives later on.
So, what are some of those things?
Well, so bird flu, both bird flu and mpox, right? We have the tools at our disposal that are necessary to combat them, right? So both, we know how to make a vaccine against flu. Matching the exact pandemic vaccine will take some time, but RNA technology is much faster than the old technology. That's about a 4 to 6 month ramp up time. But getting that up and going, getting it in place, and then stockpiling antivirals. We have good antivirals against flu. We have decent antivirals against mpox, but we don't have enough to go around, right? And so, governments around the world should be asking pharmaceutical companies to make these and have them put aside so that time it takes us to get a bespoke vaccine that's targeting the whatever pandemic strain comes out, we can be protected in that kind of interim period.
And we're ready.
And
right?
we're ready,
It's,
right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
this is kind of going to proportions beyond what is safe, and we can deploy these
Exactly.
very quickly, but in the
Exactly.
period before a vaccine would be available.
Exactly, right. Exactly, that you make this available not only just to the frontline healthcare workers, but make them available to the general public, right? And so, it's not at all clear, right? COVID hit the elderly the hardest, right? It's not clear that this virus will be the same, that the most vulnerable will be that population, right? So we need to have enough, right, where we can deploy this to anyone and everyone that gets the virus.
Yeah.
And the scary thing about this virus right now is that if you look at the historical data, the case fatality rate, which is the chances of dying if you get the virus, is at 50%, somewhere around 50%. SARS-CoV-2 was less than 1%, right? And so, people always ask me, well, you think people are going to quarantine again I'm like, look, at a 50% case
You're going
fatality
to
rate,
want to quarantine.
it's a self
You're not
quarantine.
going to want to be
Yes,
outside.
yes. People are not going to wait for the government, right?
Yeah.
If they see people dropping dead at the rates of 1 and 2, even if it's slightly lower than that,
That's very intense.
it's going to be anywhere between 20 to 50 times worse than COVID, right? And that's existential territory, right? I mean, this is things that can basically cause civil society worldwide to fall apart, right? So these are scary things, right? And even I always make an argument that even if there's a small chance of it happening, okay, the impact of it coming to fruition is worth putting in the investment.
Absolutely.
To make sure that even a low probability event that can be devastating doesn't happen, right? We do this in the military all the time, right? For terrorist attacks, for nuclear war, right? We have a lot of weapons that are thankfully unused, right? But they're there because we plan for the worst case scenario, right?
Yeah.
And we should be doing this for pandemics. We should be looking at this not just as a healthcare threat, right? But as a military threat and an economic threat and a threat to our way of life and society as we know it, right?
It just seems so crazy that it's been so difficult to get this support, to arm ourselves with a healthcare arsenal to kind of go along with the military metaphor. What are those specific barriers? Is it just that this is such a global scale problem that it's hard to kind of gain collaborations amongst all of these different?
Yes. I think there's a couple of levels, right? Getting anybody to agree on anything is
Challenging.
Is challenging, right? Unfortunately, this has been politicized, right? I mean, this is, again, an anathema to me and other science, but, they were political battle lines that were drawn.
Yeah.
I don't know how that happened. I don't know why that happened, but there's a legacy of that, right? And so, there is one side for political reasons will just downplay any threat, right? That it's not a big deal, and the last one was overblown. And I don't know how you argue that 1.2 million dead Americans is overblown in any way.
Absolutely.
But that being said, this is the reality of our political landscape, right? Again, as scientists, you want to be agnostic of that, right? It is, we are just calling balls and strikes, right? And so what people choose to do with that is really up to them, right? And there needs to be, I think, more pressure from the general public impressing upon their politicians and their leaders that, hey, look, this matters to us, right? This matters to us. This matters to our kids. We want to be ready for this, right? And, it's one of those things where you don't see it, and so it's out of mind.
It's not going to happen, right? Going back to the pre-COVID world, we couldn't picture what a 1918 Spanish flu would look like.
Exactly, right? And so we buried our heads in the sand, and if we could have, so the anecdote I like to use is that, look, no one who was paying attention was surprised that a coronavirus caused that pandemic, right? We had SARS-CoV-1, right? SARS-CoV-2 is called SARS-CoV-2 because we had SARS-CoV-1.
Right.
We had MERS, right? So these things were coming at us, right?
I think you called it was on your bingo card, I think, last time we chatted.
Yes. Yeah, no, there is a short list.
Right.
Right? There's the wild card that, could come out of nowhere, but there's a short list of viruses we all know, right, could cause the next pandemic.
Yeah.
And, influenza and coronavirus have always been the top two, right? And then, I had this list before COVID, pox viruses were on there, right? We just had a case of dengue virus here in California, right? This is all nature giving us warnings, right? And, we failed to heed those warnings before. And if we do it again, it's the saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice,
Right.
shame on me, right? This is where we are now, right? We have, no one can really say that, yeah, no, the fears of a pandemic are overblown. I think people are getting into, okay, we are, that was, the last pandemic was 100 years ago. We're not due for another one in 100 years, right? But, this is just like these hurricanes and floods and wildfires, right? The ground beneath us has shifted, right? The rules of the game have changed. So, once in 100-year floods are now happening once every 10, 20 years, once in a 100-year wildfire, same thing.
Exactly.
And hurricanes, same with pandemics, right? If I were to put money down, I would say in the next 20 years, there's greater than a 50% chance that we're going to see something, right? I mean, first of all, we're way better connected from air by traveling, right?
I would assume the virus is allowed to mutate so much more quickly just based on how much we travel.
Yeah, it's basically the playing field, right? Yeah. We are encroaching into areas that, these reservoir species generally inhabit. So there's more chance of kind of that interaction. So that chance jump, which is called a kind of zoonotic event. And then, like with dengue, the vectors that carry this, right, because of climate change, right, the footprint is changing, right? The reason now we have, Aedes aegypti, which carries dengue and West Nile and other mosquito-borne viruses, is that because, those are now, our climate is becoming more habitable to those, right? Before they were restricted to the tropics. And, and again, it's bad there. It's not great there, but it was out of sight, out of mind for us. But the climate is changing. The climate changing causes these species to adapt new areas of habitation. And that means that we're going to have more interactions with them, right? That means that there's going to be, the risk is going to get worse, not better. So that 100-year paradigm, right? You throw in a couple of airplanes that
shifting climate,
and we are primed, right? And so that's the bad news. The good news is we know what to do, right? It is just getting together, I think, the political will, right? Both domestically and internationally, right? Because this is again, viruses don't know nation states, right? That's just not a thing, right? And so this is a world issue, right? And so, we need, the first line of defense is surveillance, right? Knowing what's out there, knowing what's popping up, right? Getting a global early warning system in place, right? And that's, the first thing that we need to do, right? And that hasn't happened. That absolutely should have happened after COVID, but the WHO tried and it just fell apart. Okay, the second thing is there needs to be a more concerted effort to develop tools that can save us from this. I think I maybe mentioned this to you before, right? SARS-CoV-1 came out, people were developing drugs and vaccines, right? But by 2008, they just stopped. They said, oh, problem solved, don't have to worry about it, right? So the drugs that we have now didn't come from nowhere, right? They didn't start from scratch. The Pfizer drug was originally, Paxlovid was originally being developed for SARS-CoV-1. They stopped it, and then they kind of brushed it off and used that. They were developing a vaccine for SARS-CoV-1 that they stopped funding in 2008. Now, would that be a perfect vaccine? No. But would it have saved hundreds of thousands of lives? Yes.
It would have been a start at a time when we needed something.
Exactly,
and we really
right.
had nothing.
And the reason why pandemics become pandemics is two things, right? One, that they can be spread and so on. But, other viruses can be spread. Measles is but none of us had any pre-existing immunity, right? And so basically, it was burning through. It's like a wildfire, right?
Exactly. Your immune system is
your
just
immune
gonna...
system had no way to thwart it, and so it would pass and pass and pass, and you would have what's called an R naught, or a transmission event. So the number of times when someone gets a virus, the number of times it transmits to somebody, right? So a highly successful virus can infect one person and transmit to 10 to 20 people, right?
Yeah, just that exponential growth.
Yeah, there's that exponential growth, exactly. And when you don't have any defenses, right, it can spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
Right? But if you have some pre-existing immunity, right, even from an imperfect vaccine, right, especially if you're amongst the most vulnerable, that would have saved lives.
Yeah.
Right? So we know how to do this. We know how to do this. We can do it. It's just that there's not I think the political motivation anymore.
Or a push to invest, right?
A push to invest, right? And again, people have this fallacy that, Moderna and Pfizer came to the rescue, right? And they're gonna, keep doing this, but that's not the case, right? There's no profit motive to prepare for a pandemic, right? The profit motive is to respond to a pandemic, right?
Right.
But by that time, you're already a year to 2 years in, with millions of lives lost,
exactly.
right?
You paid the price.
You paid the price already. And so, this is something that I think the public sector really needs to focus on.
Get more involved in.
Yes, governments, NGOs. I mean, we work with the Gates Foundation. They have really forward visionary thinking in this space, right? Unfortunately, while there is support from the NIH, we have a pandemic preparedness center, which was going to be funded for 5 years, has now been cut back to 3.
In this landscape.
Right? Hopefully there are some people in Congress that think this is important enough to keep this going. But this is not just our center. These are centers around the country, right? And they, I've seen what they've done and what we're doing. And there are really important programs that are coming out of here, right? And it's very hard to do anything in 3 years, right? In 5 years, I think, is the bare minimum to be able to bring together things that could be impactful.
Especially in like the drug discovery and development
exactly.
space, right? These things, we can do it way faster than beforehand, but
right.
these things still take time.
They take time. They take time. And so, it is really, I think, an incredible missed opportunity, right, for us. And really, it's one of the few programs in the world, in the U.S., when they responded, like one of the few places that was able to do it at this scale, right?
Right. We have the resources here. We kind of have some of the infrastructure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, again, knock on wood, but I hope this is not a story that we look back 15 years from now going, boy, if we just gave a couple of more years of funding to these centers, we could have saved,
been in an entirely
different situation, right? This is, it's a lot of money, but if you look at what the potential impact of a pandemic is.
Of course, the life lost is the number one importance, but if you do want to look at it from an economic perspective,
exactly.
How much did we have to pay for
exactly.
COVID specifically? If those are the only parameters that
the economic downturn, right? Economies around the world came to a halt, right? We had to basically pump money into the economy, right, at unprecedented levels. Then we had to deal with the inflation that came from that, right? And so we're still feeling the after effects of COVID, right? And, I don't want to get into the blame game of who did what. I think economically we recovered pretty well from a catastrophic situation, but there are still implications to what we did. And again, if we had things in our arsenal that wouldn't cause us to shut down, wouldn't cause the disruption in supply chains like we saw, right? Maybe we wouldn't have needed to do that, right? And so, it was, reasonably predictable that this was going to happen. And we could have prepared for it. We didn't. But, at this point, I think that the people who will deny that, the chances of another pandemic happening is not a high enough risk to do anything about. I think you'd have to do a lot of creative and wishful thinking to arrive at that conclusion, right? And the politicians will respond if their constituents tell them, "Hey, this matters to me.
This is a big issue.
This is a big issue," right? There are other big issues on the plate. People are concerned about immigration. People are concerned about inflation. This should be right up there. One of the things, exactly right. I hope that things like this, the outreach on the part of the scientists really start to help. And I think, again, this is one of the lessons I think I learned personally and the scientific community learned at large was that we just did not do a good enough job of communicating our science to the public. Okay, and then when things happened, right, there was a vacuum, and I think disinformation loves a vacuum because they can, fill it with
fill it, right?
You just fill it with whatever
say,
you want. And, we were caught flat-footed and, we were then on the defensive trying to respond to the situation, right? Whereas I think going forward, I think it's very important for the scientific community to get out front, right? Like, incredibly important role in science that I think in general, as a community, we have neglected, right? Most of us actually don't know how to talk science to the lay public.
Well, it's hard because you're so used to talking about it with like potential partners or potential collaborators where everyone knows the lingo.
Yes.
And it's such a complicated topic.
And look, most scientists, there's not a patch of weed that they see that they don't want to just dive into, right? That's what we do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's and pulling back and saying, hey, how do I explain this to my mom or my child in 8th grade? How do we do that? That's just not something that we're trained to do, right? Even from graduate school, we're not trained to do it, right? And I really think that as a community, public communication, is as important as written communication and scientific communication to a scientific audience, right? And I hope that one of the course corrections we do, like starting in graduate school, there are courses now that we offer that we can then allow the next generation of students to really be able to better communicate to the public and frankly, much better than I think my generation and the generations before it have done.
Right, absolutely. Well, and I think too, since COVID, everyone thinks that they are somewhat of a scientific expert. I think it really brought science back into the limelight in a way that maybe it had retreated for a while.
It's fantastic because now when I say PCR or antigen tests, or people's eyes are not like antibodies. They're like
mRNA.
They're like, what are you talking about? But also there's a situation where a little bit of knowing a little bit can be actually more dangerous.
Yeah, just enough to be dangerous.
Just enough to be dangerous, right? And so, and this is not just science. You've seen this kind of sweeping across the political landscape in the U.S. and Europe. This is a mistrust of expertise, right?
Exactly.
And look, you can blame anyone and everyone you want in that, but I think the experts are tasked with gaining that trust back. That is our job. We lost it. Now you can say, okay, well, people propelled it, but it was ours to lose, and we lost it. We did not do a good enough job, I think, of protecting the public, right? And informing the public to keep their trust and gain their trust. And I think that's, again, a key part of pandemic preparedness, right? That you go to a heart surgeon that has experience, in 20, 30 years, right, to get a bypass, right? You don't want to get a bypass from some guy who, saw a YouTube video and
I can do it.
Yeah, and I can do it, right? I mean, but this is kind of a similar thing. I've been doing this for 25 years. I don't know everything. It's impossible to predict the future, but probably have a better idea of what
than the average person.
Than the average person.
Find on the street.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. And then and I think that we were derelict in our responsibility to kind of communicate to people why. Mm-hmm. And that why are we doing this? There were a lot of edicts kind of given on high, 6 feet, where and people didn't realize that, hey, listen, this was an organism that we didn't know existed on the face of the earth. I mean, all of our directions were coming from previous viruses that we looked at to predict what and the thing about science is, okay, when new data comes in, you reassess what your conclusions are, and you make a new decision on a new guidance, right? And so it's as important in science to admit you're wrong as it is to be right, right? Because it's a process. It's a process.
Scientific method.
Exactly.
Everyone hopefully knows about it, but we're constantly learning, constantly having to shift our perspective.
Exactly. And I think that people who don't change their mind when they're confronted with new information, mm-hmm. those are the ones that you should be wary of.
Yeah.
Right? The people who will dig in and say, well, this is what I said, and I don't,
I'm just going to die on
I'm just going to die on this hill, right? And those are the people that you shouldn't trust,
yeah.
right? The people who you should trust are the ones that can admit that, yeah, we're wrong.
We were working with faulty information beforehand.
We didn't have enough information. Yeah. The new information coming in saying, oh, well, the surgical masks are not helping with this virus. The N95 masks are the ones you're going to want to, mm-hmm. right? But people, I think, didn't understand that it was a process, right?
Exactly.
That,
we're all learning together.
Yeah, and we knew that there's certain vaccines that can be protective, right? And we knew there's certain vaccines that can just minimize the risk of a negative outcome, right? And so I think that, it was when the vaccines first came out, it was like, oh, that's it. Now here's your cape.
You're never gonna have to worry about it again. Yeah.
And I think that that wasn't these kinds of nuances weren't adequately communicated to people who want kind of black and white answers, right? And so I think that was we're talking about the challenges of scientific communication. It's a lot about nuance.
Yeah.
But you want to have to communicate. Yeah, you want to communicate the gray area to people who want yes or no answers, right? And I mean, I don't blame them, right? There's only so many hours in a day, and you just and I think it's important that you tell people, well, this is what we know to the best of our knowledge, and why, and let's explain it, right? And then when that guidance shifts or changes, right, it doesn't come as a surprise that, oh, you guys have no idea what you're talking about.
It's like, okay, this was caveated to me initially.
Exactly.
And therefore, I'm not shocked about it.
Yes.
So hopefully in lighter terms, what are some of the exciting things that you're working on here in terms of pandemic preparedness, as well as some of the other scientists?
Yeah, I mean, so, the great thing about COVID, at least for virologists, is that we got to work with a lot of people in a lot of areas that previously they weren't interested in viruses. Mm-hmm. And so that legacy is continuing. And so, we're bringing people into the fold and working with people in a lot of different areas, and especially here at Scripps, right? The chemistry is unbelievable. Mm-hmm. Working with people in that department, in the neuro department. So the things that are exciting to me, right, is the drugs that we're building now, right? We're pivoting from what's traditionally been called a one bug, one drug approach to viruses, right? So with bacteria, you can get broad spectrum antibiotics. You don't need to know exactly what bacteria you're in. With viruses, you typically need to know exactly what you're infected with. Mm-hmm. But working with Arnab, I know you had him on here, and the folks at Caliber and within our pandemic preparedness program, it's called CAMP. We're building tools now that can work across different viruses. And so we're hoping to, I know everyone heard about test to treat, that, you stick something up your nose, they get COVID, call it in. But then, nowadays it can be COVID, it can be RSV, it can be flu, it can be metapneumo, it can be adeno. So, what happens is then not everyone has kits for all of those, and some they don't even exist. And typically you want to onboard antivirals within the first couple of days and they become less and less efficacious.
The longer you go without it. Yeah.
And so if you have what's called a broad spectrum antiviral, right? If you call up your doc and you tell him or her that, hey, I got these symptoms, and they can rule out a bacterial infection, right? They don't need to know what the viral infection is, right? It's a respiratory virus. We're going to give you this pill, and
it's going to work.
It's going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it covers all of them. It doesn't just cover one, right? It covers all of them, right? And so we're moving towards there, and we have a number of exciting programs, right, that we think can cover multiple viral families, right? And so I think that this is going to change the paradigm of, how we deal with respiratory infections. Mm-hmm. Like most of us are like, oh, it's viral, I'm going to sit around and just feel sorry for myself for a couple of days.
Exactly, like that antibiotics are going to be ineffective.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I think, from a day-to-day treatment, that's great. But from pandemic preparedness, right, that's where you want to be. Mm-hmm. Because chances are, like, viruses don't come from nowhere, right? They come from evolving from other viruses, mm-hmm. right? So chances are, if we can treat all the viruses that we have now, right, we should be able to treat the viruses that'll come out in the future.
Exactly, right? Especially if you're targeting very similar mechanisms.
Exactly, and there are things that all viruses share, right? There are engines within the virus that are common, right? And if you can hit at the heart of that engine, and that mechanism is shared by a lot of different viruses, you can really kind of build this type of treatment that not only can help with kind of your day-to-day winter respiratory viruses, but when the next virus comes, right, we can very quickly test, see if it works, and then move it to, this was a story with remdesivir, right? Remdesivir was not built for SARS-CoV-2, right? It was, before that was considered an Ebola drug, right? They were testing it for mm-hmm. Ebola, and then, but they hit kind of similar processes, and so they quickly pivoted to SARS-CoV-2, right? Now we want to build something that, can cover basically all of the respiratory viruses that we have currently, and then as soon as the new one comes out, we can test it in a dish. We know that it'll be safe. We know that it'll work, and we can just pivot and say,
you can maybe tweak it a little bit if necessary. Yeah.
Yes, if we need to, change the dosing or what have you, we can do that. But, we will have something at the ready, right?
The arsenal.
Yes,
go back.
Exactly, right? The stockpile. And so that's really exciting that, to me, this is game-changing stuff, right? This changes the landscape for both, in the antiviral space, right? But, to future-proof us for the next pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? I feel like that was such a good note to end on.
Yes, let's stay optimistic. I would encourage people to,
care
about this. Be more educated, learn more. I encourage my colleagues to reach out more. And I think the thing, if you want to do something, right, is to really reach out to your elected leaders and say, hey, this matters to me, right? This matters to me. This matters to future generations. I know that, you're not going to get reelected based on, pandemic preparedness, but this is something that we need to invest in long term as a country and as a planet, right? And so if we can push our leaders to have kind of a longer term vision, I think we will all benefit, and our kids will benefit, and their kids will reap the rewards for the forward thinking that we had at this time, and not kind of the kind of reactive situation that we were placed in because our predecessors did not do what should have been done to get us ready for that event.